how does Locke understand the state of nature, that state in which we would be subject to no sort of government authority? That is not to say, by the way, as some people think, that we would all simply be individuals. There would be no social structure at all. That's not the point. The point is there would be no government authority. There would be no political authority. He's not saying that there would be no groups of people. What he is saying is that there would be no government. We would be in a state of anarchy, meaning simply no government, no political authority at all. What would that be like? Imagine for a moment, for example, that the police, the courts, the legislature, the governor, everybody connected with the government simply decided to quit. They all just said, you know what, forget it. We've given up on this whole project of leading the country or leading the city or leading the state. Forget it, we're going home. There is no more government. Best of luck to you all. What would happen? Thomas Hobbes had written about this and thought the result would be disastrous. He said it would be a war of all against all, and the life of man would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Now Locke disagrees. He says it would not be a state of war. We would be able to defend ourselves, and in fact we would band together with other groups of like-minded people to defend each other. And so he thinks we would form voluntary groups in such a situation in order to protect ourselves and protect one another. Well, that would prevent it, mostly, he says, from being a war of all against all. But nevertheless, there would be serious problems. Before we get to the problems, though, I want to think about an aspect of what that would be like. We would band together. And Hobbes had said, there simply is no injustice where there is no law. But Locke disagrees. He says, look, even in the state of nature, even where there is no government or other political authority over us, nevertheless, certain things would be wrong. We would have certain natural rights, rights inherent in us as human beings that do not depend on the government. What are those rights? He says, the state of nature has a law of nature to govern it. Namely, no one shall harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. Nobody can take somebody else's life, even in the state of nature. It's not because there's a law against murder that murder is wrong and that you have a right to life. It's because you're a human being. You have dignity. There are certain things that are inherent in you. You have a right to preserve yourself. You have a right to try to defend yourself. You have specifically a right to life. It is wrong to kill you, even if there is no law against it. Also, he says, your life, your health. It is wrong to injure you, to in some way maim you, or make you sick, poison you. Those things are wrong even in the state of nature. It's not just because they're against the law that they're wrong. They're against the moral law, the law of nature. In the state of nature, you have rights to life, health, liberty, and possessions. And so liberty is an important part of that. It is wrong to kidnap you, wrong to imprison you, wrong to enslave you, even in the state of nature. It's not just because there's a law against slavery or a law against kidnapping that it's wrong. It's wrong by its very nature because you're a human being and you have a right to liberty. And the same thing, he says, is true of property. You have certain possessions and it is your right to control those. Somebody who steals from you, who robs you, that person is doing wrong to you, even if there is no law, even if there is no political authority to say so. It is wrong simply because you have a right to live as you choose. You have a right to life. You have a right to health. You have a right to liberty. You have a right to property, even in the state of nature. So, Locke concludes, the state of nature would not be a war of all against all, as Hobbes thought. No, instead, it would be, well, a bit dangerous, maybe a bit rougher than a society under the rule of law. Nevertheless, he says, people would fairly effectively defend themselves. A good example of this might be the Wild West, back when things were territories, before there was even a territorial government. Was there widespread violence? The answer, maybe surprisingly, is no. If you weren't a young man who hung out in saloons and got into gunfights, then actually the Wild West before the formation of territorial governments or statehood was actually pretty safe. Now, almost everyone was armed, everyone was able to defend themselves, and people formed communities so that they could protect one another. But that turned out to be fairly effective. Now, what was the problem? Why would people in that situation seek a government for the territory or eventually the state? Well, the answer is not that they were in such great danger and that life was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, but instead that they were afraid of the posses, they were afraid of the vigilante groups, they were afraid of the people who would enforce the law unfairly. What would go wrong? Well, think about what happens, let's say, in an old west town in this kind of situation on the frontier. If, let's say, somebody is robbed, somebody rustles their cattle, what do they do about it? They might get together a posse, and they go out hunting for the cattle rustlers. Now notice it is the injured party, and the people closest to the injured party, who form that posse and go out looking for the miscreants. And so the same people who are victims or closely connected to the victim of the crime become the enforcers of the law. They become the police, the judge, the jury, the executioner. And that's a very dangerous situation. You might think, wait a minute, if I get accused of something, a posse might attack me, they might punish me, jail me, or even kill me as a criminal, and I don't have a chance to defend myself. I don't have a chance for a lawyer. I don't have a trial. Wait a minute, these posses are simply going to hunt someone down, may or may not be the right person. There's nothing to protect the accused. Well, we would be, in short, not so much afraid of the criminal in such a situation as afraid of things going wrong with the vigilante groups, the posses, that would form to enforce the law. We would seek impartial judgment from people who were not connected to the crime. We wouldn't want the same people to be victim and police, judge, jury, and executioner. So, what would we do? We'd separate those functions. We would give up our right to enforce the law of nature ourselves. Now, we would retain the right to protect ourselves. We wouldn't give that up. But we would give up the right to enforce the law, to act as police, judge, jury, and executioner. And in return for that, we would expect impartial judgment. We would expect the rule of law to deal with people impartially. There's a reason that statues of justice show justice blindfolded. It's because justice is supposed to be blind to the particulars and deal with everyone fairly according to the same rules. That's what we'd seek. Now, how does Locke answer these questions? Let's take a look then. The state of nature is not, as in Hobbes, a state of war, of all against all, but it is a state of some degree of danger. It is a state where we say we are in danger, not to some degree from criminals, from those who would violate the law of nature, but also from partial enforcement of that. The same people will be victim, judge, jury, executioner. And so we create a political authority that is going to give us that. We are going to give up a certain amount of our freedom. Now, not all of our liberties, but we are going to give up our natural right to enforce the law of nature. So we'll give up our enforcement right, our right to execute the law of nature, as he puts it. And what do we expect to gain? We expect to gain impartial judgment. Now, what are the criteria we use here? Well, as in Hobbes, we're thinking primarily in terms of our own self-interest. We're thinking what would be best for me, what would make me safest, what would guarantee my natural rights. And so one way of cashing this out for Locke is not simply to say self-interest, but to say, in addition, I am doing this in order to protect my natural rights, my rights to life, health, liberty, and property. And so, what principles would I adopt? Well, I expect that kind of impartial judgment. And Locke says, actually, that means something quite specific. We are entering into the contract the better to secure our natural rights, and so we are going to demand some things in return. Not simply in general impartial judgment, but some things that are more specific. He says that freedom of men under government is to have a standing rule to live by, common to everyone, of that society, and made by the legislative power, duly erected in it, a liberty to follow my own will in all things where the rule prescribes not, and not to be subject to the inconstant, uncertain, unknown, arbitrary will of another man. So, what am I guaranteed here? Well, if we think about the principles here, I am guaranteed a standing rule. So, in other words, there is to be a body of law, and I have a right now to the rule of law. It is something common to everyone in that society. So it is something held by us in common. There are no differentials under the law. People are treated equally under the law. So you might say part of this is what we now refer to as equal protection of the laws. It is to be made by the legislative power. And that is key. These laws are not to be imposed by just officials. They are to be imposed by the representatives of the people who face election. Now, it's interesting to think how in advanced societies today, we've deviated very far from Locke's conditions, even in countries like the United States, which are supposedly founded on Lockean principles. Congress is supposed to be making the laws of the federal government, but in fact, are federal laws made by Congress? These days, they are usually not. They are usually produced by administrative agencies. It's worth remembering that those agencies go back only about a century. The oldest of them are only about a century old. For most of the history of the United States, Congress really did make the laws. But now, in a procedure codified by the Administrative Procedures Act, passed in the late 1940s, just after World War II, most law is actually made by unelected bureaucrats. And that's a radical departure from Locke's vision. Laws are supposed to be made by the legislature that faces the people and allows, in that way, the people to be making the laws themselves through their elected representatives. We have a liberty to follow my own will in all things, where the rule prescribes not. I retain my right to liberty to do things unless they are specifically prohibited by the laws passed by the legislature. And finally, I am to be free of the partial judgment of someone else, the arbitrary will of another. So I am to be free from arbitrary decrees, arbitrary will. The liberty to do what you want, where the law prescribes not, is very important for Locke. There's a joke that indicates different countries' attitudes. I won't vouch for the accuracy of this, but in any case, the joke goes like this. In America, everything is permitted except that which is prohibited. In Germany, everything's prohibited except that which is permitted. In the old Soviet Union, everything was prohibited, especially that which was permitted. And in Italy, everything is permitted, especially that which is prohibited. Well, as I say, it's not meant to be an accurate ethnic portrayal, but the idea is this. We don't get permission from the government to do things. Certain things are ruled out. We are required to do certain things by government. But we have permission to do anything that they do not rule out. So there is kind of a blanket background permission. You are allowed to do anything you want except for the following boundaries. That's very different from thinking you're prohibited from doing all sorts of things unless specifically you are given a permit. And if we think about various aspects of the law, we start realizing not all of them in most societies actually comply with Locke's vision. After all, in lots of places, you can't build things without getting a permit. Locke would say, look, there are certain things that might be prohibited, certain things that might be required, but you should be allowed to do whatever you want. You don't have to get a permit or a license or whatever to do these things. Just make sure you follow these rules and don't do any of the prohibited things. But we require permits to retile your shower, for example, or a permit to put some kind of structure in your backyard. We require licenses to cut hair or braid hair or drive a car or do all sorts of things. And so all of those are really departures from Locke's vision, that we should be allowed to do what we want unless we're doing something specifically ruled out by the law.